Welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand under the company Horns of Odin. As always, before we jump into the show, I do have to plug our Patreon. It is how we keep the lights on. I know I say it every single week, but if you can pop over to Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast, have a look on there. There's a bunch of bonus material that you get. A bonus episode every single week. You get access to our Discord server. You get early access to episodes. You get the whole back catalogue. Starts from £3 a month, which is the price of a cup of coffee. So, yeah, if you can, go and check it out. If you can't, just a 5-star rating, positive review, wherever you get your podcasts. And that's it, because I'm so excited to get into this episode. I'm always thrilled when Leszek comes and joins us. So, for those of you that... actually, how rude of me. Mags, I know you're still playing with your camera. I forgot to introduce you first.
No worries, go ahead.
So
I'm just here in the background for the timing.
Because you just sorting your camera out. So obviously that lovely voice is my lovely co-host and in-house archaeologist, Margrethe Havgar. Margrethe, nice to see you.
Nice to see all of you.
So our guest today is Dr. Leszek Gardela. He is a... Oh, you always give me lovely words, Leszek. Prividocent at Ludwig.
Yeah.
At Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich and leader of the Slavs in the North project, funded by the Gerda Henkel Foundation. And he is an expert on Slavic and Scandinavian Viking Age archaeology and has a keen interest in the 19th and 20th century art inspired by Slavic myths and folklore. Leszek, thank you for joining us once again. I think this is your third time?
Yes, it is. Yeah. It's a magic number. 3 is always a magic number. So
it is, yeah.
It's great to be back. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I know you just said before that it's been 2 years since we
Almost 2 years, yeah.
Yeah, such a long time. But it doesn't feel like it. It feels like it was maybe 6 months ago.
Yeah.
It's so exciting to have you here, Leszek. I'm so excited to talk about today's topic.
I'm very happy to be back. It's always a pleasure to see you two guys.
So where are you in the world now?
I'm in Poznań, so my hometown in Poland.
Oh, okay.
This is also where my project, the Slavs in the North project, where it's based. But the project is very international, so it also involves going to all kinds of different places that in one way or another are linked to the Slavs and the Slavic world, but I'm actually planning a bigger trip around Scandinavia to look for Slavic traces in Scandinavia.
Oh, wonderful!
I'll be talking a little bit about that in the lecture today. So I don't want to spoil the fun just now.
The lecture, yeah, I love that.
Lecture, like it's.
Oh no, that sounds good to me.
I mean, it is sort of like a lecture, but I think it's not going to be that sort of serious and academic as in the university classroom. I'd like this to be a conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what we're aiming for. So yeah, we'll go from obviously introducing you here, and there is a new little title on the start of your name, which is Habil, which I'd never heard of before. What is that?
Yeah, it's a title that one receives mainly in German or Polish, Czech, and Slovak academia, and it's when you write the second PhD thesis, but one that is much more complex, much bigger, and this basically gives you the qualification of a full professor. So that's what the title means, that you are professorable, so to say. And in my case, like I mentioned earlier, I wrote a book called The Vikings in Poland, which is a book that I had been working on for 20 years, basically, since the very start of my academic career. It's a book that I always wanted to write, and this was just a great opportunity to finally do it.
So how come you didn't write? Because you mentioned before it was... So I guess it goes your PhD and you write a dissertation for that, and then above that is Habil.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you write a longer dissertation to achieve that. How come you didn't use the book you wrote now, the Slavs in Poland, the Vikings in Poland, for the PhD dissertation?
Well, I wanted to actually originally. That was the original idea to do my PhD based on the Vikings in Poland. But at the time, I couldn't really find the right supervisor for this kind of project. And I think that I just wasn't ready for it yet. And I'm actually really glad that I didn't. Because, and I think that generally the academic world was not ready for this kind of book. And also after 2012, which is when I defended my PhD in Aberdeen, this is when the really interesting things began to happen in Slavic Scandinavian archaeology. So everything comes at the right moment, I think. And this book came at the right time, I think. I had to wait for it, but it happened. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah.
So I think sometimes you just have to grow up to approach a certain topic and take on a certain topic. And I think,
it is that kind of thing where things will just kind of not fall in place for a reason, and then eventually it does, and life just kind of sorts itself out like that.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting when I sort of look back at my academic career and the different topics that I delved into over the years. It's not really something I sort of planned, but it's really interesting how one thing leads to another in a very natural way. It's almost like in Hávamál, in the songs of the High One, that words create words out of words and so on. It's like it all sort of evolves in a very organic way. And
that's so true. That's such a good point.
Yeah. And I think that it's the same for me, because somehow, you create the root foundations, and then you grow simply like a tree. And that's also how this research grows. And so what I want to show you today is, again, a sort of a natural development of the many things that I have been investigating and experimenting with over the years. Something very new, I suppose. It will be very new to a lot of people. It's also very new generally in academia, in the field of both Slavic and Scandinavian archaeology, I think.
At the risk of getting ahead of myself, new in what way?
In every single way, I would say.
Okay, cool. All right.
Well, yeah. First of all, I think because for quite a long time, there's been this idea that the Slavic world, and even among Slavic scholars, there's been this idea that the Slavic world is somewhat less interesting or less intricate, or that the worldviews are not so sophisticated as in the case of, for instance, the Germanic people. And I can understand why it was so. One reason is that the corpus of sources, the archaeology, but also the textual material, it just isn't or wasn't as vast and as detailed. But I think, as I said, over the last 10 years or so, there's a lot of new material that has come to light, and it's quite groundbreaking and really fascinating. And one of the reasons why I started with Viking and Scandinavian archaeology was because there was a time when I thought that Slavic archaeology just wasn't very interesting for me. Yeah, but now I'm very much into the Slavic thing.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. Do you think that, obviously, there's been a time period, or I think with a lot of people get interested in the Viking Age, there's this look to the West and a constant fixation on going to, into the British Isles, and then to Iceland and to Greenland, and then to Lands of Meadows. Like, there is this idea that gets in most people's mind that is the root, and this whole eastern side just gets forgotten about.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly the case, and that is also why I decided to also return to my own roots, my sort of own Slavic heritage, and to promote and also research this this part of the world, and in a way connect it to the Scandinavian world, and to demonstrate that the Baltic Sea was not a border. It was more like a big, pond, basically, like a channel of communication, a motorway of the Viking Age that was not a barrier, but a place of interaction. And these, as you say, there's always been this kind of focus on Viking contacts with the West, and to a certain extent with the East, and not so much with the South or with Central Europe, because that's really where the territory of Poland is. It's neither East nor West. It's somewhere right in the middle. It's like the central Baltic, central part of Europe, and that has for quite some time been a sort of a blank space for a lot of researchers. So I'm trying to change that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm trying to think of how to word this, because I have a question, and I don't want it to come across in any way offensive. But obviously, there's such an interest for you in the Slavic world. Is there, I guess, that connection between the Viking and kind of Slavic cultures? I guess that's always a good way, to kind of connect the two will always grow the Slavic side of things. Does that make sense? Because the Viking Age is such a powerhouse that when you can kind of tie those two together, does that then bring people into then hopefully people will then take more of a focus on just the Slavic history and just the Slavic folklore. Did that make sense?
Well, kind of like a gateway drug?
Yeah, like because I think in a lot of ways, if you can tie anything to the Viking Age in some way, it can then pull people from this huge, like I said, powerhouse of interest, and you can then pull them down to something which is a little bit less known. And I didn't want it to come across as though I was saying that Slavic history wasn't important, because it clearly is, but it kind of helps bring people through. And I wondered if that was intentional at all.
No, I think what I'm actually trying to do is to show that we should stop thinking about, we're talking about Scandinavian history and Slavic history, or Germanic history, or Slavic history, or Baltic history. Okay. It's just history. It's all one part of one world, one universe, if you like, historical universe, and it's more about trying to find a symmetry also between these different cultures and between these different societies that lived in very similar ways at an exactly the same time in a very big, in many ways, multicultural, cosmopolitan area. So that's all I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to favor one cultural group over another. Just bring a little bit more attention to those groups that have not received enough attention over the years. I think that's just that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think last time we spoke, it was clear how little that I had ever heard of, the whole Slavic mythology side of things. And I think that was the same for probably most Western Europeans, that it was just a whole area that we just aren't taught about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And of course, there are many reasons why this is so. And one is, of course, the linguistic barrier, the complicated history of Central and Eastern Europe, which basically, until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of communism, was somewhat separated from everything Western and Northern. But this was a long time ago, and we're long past that stage. So I think it's great to be open. It's great to collaborate. And I think it's also great that on a podcast like yours, which is about, the Norse mythology, we can also talk about Slavic topics and see where these belief systems meet and how they differ, and how these societies interacted and traveled and did things together. I think that opens a lot of exciting doors, I think.
100%. And also I'm thinking to your earlier point about the focus previously having, been kind of zoomed in on to the west and to the east. The fact that there is this kind of blank spot almost to the south, then I'm thinking just in a larger perspective too, is we keep harping on about, how trade and, intercultural communities were so important. And the more research is being done into what we like to refer to as the Viking Age being done, we see all of those patterns. And then if we then don't have insight into, the southern connections in Slavic areas, then I feel like we're missing potentially a lot in that picture.
And I think it's also good for every researcher or just enthusiast of history to just get out of the box and just try and look at something else and see something else and understand the diversity of Viking Age culture broadly understood in terms of the material culture, worldviews, languages, customs, everything. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I wonder how often somebody will focus on an area for so long and then they'll maybe take a second to lift their head up and look at another
a lot of
area.
And
then when they look at this other area, they may see similarities or something that's used in a different way and go, oh, actually, that we can take from that. We can understand, because it might be different, but you can still learn from other cultures.
Totally. Yeah. So shall we jump into it?
Yeah, let's
do it.
Let's do that. So
I was just going to say, as a disclaimer for anybody only listening, I would recommend going over to our YouTube channel and popping this episode on there, because Leszek always brings a lovely slideshow and a PowerPoint presentation for us. I got a lovely glass of wine this week so I could feel sophisticated whilst I listened to you.
Look at you.
I know. I'm very excited. So Leszek, over to you.
Yeah. So I called this talk today the Slavic Animal Style in the Viking Age, but I know that you also mentioned the idea of snakes drinking milk, and this was the catch for today's episode.
I thought it was a nice title.
It's also a cool title, and I will talk a lot about snakes and about milk indeed. But I think because as we said earlier, this part of the Viking world, broadly understood, the Slavic area, has to a lot of people and is to a lot of people a sort of a blank spot. So I will give a very, very brief introduction to the geography and just the area so that everyone's on the same page, so to say. Some of your listeners may have heard the last episode that we filmed, recorded over a year ago. So you can also go back to that one for a little bit more insight. But yeah, so essentially with the Slavic world, the Slavs are the largest ethno-linguistic group in Europe still today, and they form over half of Europe's population. So this is a very, very big and very diverse group of people. And because they are so diverse, scholars have sort of divided the Slavs into three groups. So there are the Western Slavs, and the Western Slavs include today's Poles and Czechs and Slovaks, but also some of the societies, some of the peoples that originally lived in what is today northeastern Germany. Then we have the Eastern Slavs that include Russians and Belarusians and Rusins and Ukrainians, and the Southern Slavs, Slovenes, Bulgars, Macedonians, Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, and Montenegrins. So it's a very, very big area. And of course, we cannot cover it all in one talk. We would probably need a whole lecture series for that. And I'm also not competent really enough to talk about all these different Slavic groups. So I will focus on the one that's closest to my heart and the one that I myself represent as someone coming from Poland, and that is the Western Slavs. So this is more or less roughly the area where these Western Slavs lived and live today to a large extent. So essentially with this light yellow color, you can see pretty much almost the entire area of today's Poland with the different regions. You can see the area known as Pomerania up in the north along the Baltic coast. Then a little further to the south, you have a district called, or area called Greater Poland. This is where I'm based now in the city of Poznań. And then you can also see to the west parts of what is today northern Germany, together with the island of Rügen, with the famous temple of Arkona. We talked about the four-faced god Svantevit last time, so that's the spot, that's the area where allegedly his temple was raised. So this is essentially the Slavic world, and you can see in the map how close it is to Scandinavia. It's just, well, next door across the Baltic, basically. It's
not far. It's not far. I'm thinking like the extensive amount of research that's been done on, connections with Iceland and with the, British Isles and Ireland, and to a certain extent, North America. And I'm like, this is, a hop, skip, and a boat ride away. It's right so there.
Close. It's so much closer than Britain is.
Yeah, it is. And as a matter of fact, if you're very desperate, and I know people have actually done it, you can take an inflatable boat and actually basically take it all across the Baltic from the coast of Poland to the coast of Sweden. People have actually done it. It's possible. So
I believe that. I mean, you just like the space between Norway and Denmark seems bigger to me. I might be getting like the dimensions wrong from the map, but also like Gotland and Sweden, they don't seem that much closer than the northmost tip of Poland.
And especially, I think this map also illustrates that it's actually also not far at all from Poland or northern Germany, those Slavic areas in northern Germany, to Denmark. Depending on where exactly you live, it can traveling to Scandinavia, to Denmark, can take from a day to maybe a month or so. So it's very, very close.
So I have a couple of quick questions on the previous.
Right off the bat, I love it.
On the previous slide, just to clear up, would the Rus have fit into the Eastern Slavs?
Yes.
So obviously, a lot of people, most people have heard of the Rus, the Rus Vikings.
Yeah.
Okay, that was the first thing I just wanted to kind of check up on. And then if we go,
it's a little bit more complicated with the Rus, but we're not going to get into that. What that really means, or what kind of group of people this was, but essentially. Yes, the Kievan Rus are Eastern.
We can do a whole episode on just what that means.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And then this is a silly question: is Pomerania where Pomeranian dogs come from? Do we know that?
Yeah. That's definitely where the name comes from.
Yeah, I just wondered. And then Bornholm, I never realized where it was, but Jonas and Emily Lorentzen come from the little Bornholm Island, and I know Jonas would love that. He's a regular on the podcast, and it's quite interesting seeing how close it is to where we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so to move on, so we will first focus on the area of Poland, or what is today Poland, and especially this part you can see here known as Greater Poland, because this is the place where the Polish state was born, where everything happened for this country, and this is also the place that was and is very, very well remembered in Polish history and Polish imagination. And this is also the place that was an area that was governed by two historical rulers. The first one you can see on the left-hand side, Mieszko the First. That's the first historically approved, authentic ruler of the Piast state of Poland, and then his son Bolesław the Brave. And we are talking about a period between the late 10th and 11th century. And this was a very turbulent time in Polish history, because this was the time when these two gentlemen were strengthening their power, when they were uniting all the different scattered tribes under their own rule. But this was also
sounds vaguely familiar to other areas. Yeah.
So what is happening essentially in Greater Poland when these two gentlemen were in charge is very similar to what was happening in Denmark at around the same time during the reign of guys like Harald Bluetooth and Svein Forkbeard. This is exactly the same process. A couple of very prominent individuals with power, with a group of warriors, with a group of followers, and with an idea, with a vision, are trying to create something more stable, something more concrete, essentially an early state. But in the case of Mieszko, and during his time, there is also one other thing that's happening, because Mieszko realizes that for him to be recognized in the eyes of Western European rulers as a rightful leader and a powerful chieftain, he cannot remain a pagan, because he of course is born as a pagan. He has to convert, and he has to accept Christianity, and of course ideally also convert his people. So during the reign of Mieszko, he accepts Christianity and allegedly forces or convinces others to also become Christian. So this is also the time of a religious conversion, the second half of the 10th century in Greater Poland.
Again, vaguely familiar themes.
Exactly, and also almost exactly at the same time as in the case of Denmark. But of course, all these changes, the sort of unification of the state, the introduction of the new religion, it didn't come easy. And for them to be able to do that, they needed a group of trusted followers and a group of warriors, because a lot of these decisions you have to negotiate not with just, a flowery speech, but with a sword in hand. So you need this group of warriors to exercise your will. Mm-hmm. And this is what we see very clearly in archaeology, in the archaeology from the 10th and 11th century, and especially in the archaeology of weapons and equestrian equipment. And when we met last time, we talked about these fantastic spurs that I also have here.
Mm-hmm. They are beautiful.
These are right now one of the most iconic objects that are associated with Western Slavic elites of the 10th and 11th century. But this was not always the case, actually. When these items were originally found, a lot of researchers were actually not too eager to associate them with the Slavs. They were quite convinced that they should be linked with different groups of people, with some Eastern European nomads, for instance. Then there was this idea that maybe they actually have something to do with Scandinavia, that the animal style that you can see here is more Scandinavian. Of course, it's not, but this was in the 1940s and 1950s. So the understanding of these nuances wasn't very sophisticated at the time.
I have no idea what you're talking about. What? The 1940s weren't, what? But I have a couple of questions, if you allow me. The picture that we're looking at right now, I assume at least the leather, but is this a reproduction?
This is a replica. Yeah. Yes. The original object is not as beautifully preserved.
I would assume so, but you never know. So I just wanted to make sure. And also when you refer to them as zoomorphic, that means that they exclusively have animal-based figures on them, right?
Yeah, they have, and I will talk more about that in a bit. But they have representations of at least 4 different kinds of animals. But also the spur as such is in animal form. You cannot quite see it here in this slide, but actually the terminals of spur have the shape of a snake. So the whole body,
the whole body looks
like a snake, and that's really zoomorphic.
The whole thing
proper sense of the word. So
and it looks
wearing a snake on your shoe or on your foot,
and it looks as though the part that I'm looking at on the picture where it's the leather that comes down through the sort of holding bit and the clasp that looks like a little bird head at the bottom.
Yeah,
almost.
it is. It is most likely a bird here.
Mm-hmm.
And then
yeah.
These three figures are probably cattle.
Oh, I thought they were reindeer. I was like, this would fit.
I was thinking rams.
So well.
Suggestions that that they are reindeer, but that's highly unlikely. And I think by the end of today's meeting, you will understand.
I'm interested to see, because I have to admit the curl on the head immediately got me thinking of rams.
Yeah,
ram's
Jennifer
horns.
just said
that was also
sheep.
one suggestion that some people had. Yeah,
I mean, I might be getting ahead of what you're currently talking about, but you said that the what's this idea that was pitched that I don't know if I understood you correctly, whether they thought that this was connected to kind of Scandinavian animal art, or whether this actually was Scandinavian animal art.
Well, both actually.
Yeah, because I feel like that's very typical of like some hotshot researchers. Exactly. I'm so sorry for generalizing, coming in and just being no, this is probably ours actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I think this those ideas stemmed from a very impressionistic ideas of what Scandinavian Viking Age styles were all about, and from this kind of immediate assumption that, first of all, the Slavs were not sort of sophisticated enough to create an object as beautiful as this, so it has to be a foreign import, and that because it has to do with war and with horseback riding, and because it is a Viking Age object, well, the obvious conclusion could be, it came from the north. And it's fascinating, and I have actually tracked down the entire historiography surrounding these objects. It's fascinating how over the course of 70 years, these ideas would be abandoned, and then people would come back to them without actually having any solid arguments for the Scandinavian artistic connection. But there will be a connection to Scandinavia. We'll get to it in a second.
Cool.
Is that
sorry for getting ahead of it. I get so excited about this.
Is that something that happens quite often, that you'll find, or a piece will be found, and then you'll have different groups vying for it and being like,
exactly.
that's ours.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially I think in the case of Polish archaeology. And what I use the term de-Vikingizing Polish archaeology, because that's what I'm really trying to do to demonstrate that a lot of people over the years have, as I said earlier, somewhat impressionistically approached this this kind of material, this elite material, and just were keen to add foreign labels to objects that, as it turns out, were actually local and produced by the Western Slavs and the Western Slavic elites. But I'll show you a few more pictures that are also linked to this elite group of warriors from the 10th and 11th century. And you can see on this slide, you can see these fantastic, very large, actually, axes. We call them T-shaped axes or long-bladed axes.
How big are they?
Quite long. They can be over 20 centimeters. The blade can be over 20 centimeters in length.
Oh shit!
That's a solid piece of metal.
Yeah. What's the difference with that and say a bearded axe?
It's like a bearded axe, but the blade is relatively narrow.
Okay.
Which also begs the question of, is it actually a weapon, or in the proper sense of the word, or is it maybe something more ceremonial, or maybe something emblematic of a certain position that the owner held in the society? One thing that's really interesting about these axes is that not all of them, but quite a few, actually have beautiful inlay with in silver or in copper alloy. And sometimes these inlays form geometric patterns, but sometimes they also have inlaid animal motifs. And this is where we are slowly approaching the main theme here, which is building up the tension, the idea of the animal style. And you can see on these two axes here that in red, I marked this in red. You can see on the one at the top of the page, you can see that there's a shape of some kind of four-legged creature, perhaps something similar to a horse. And then the one below also has a quadruped, but this one has horns. It looks a bit horse-like, but maybe it's a bull, or maybe it's actually not even a real creature from our world. Maybe it's some kind of fantastic being. And then you have, on the right-hand side, you have stirrups. So again, something associated with horse riding. That's where you put your foot when you sit in the saddle. And they also have these intricate designs. But here, it takes a while to understand that what you're looking at is not a floral or a geometric ornament, that what you're looking at is actually a snake or a representation of a snake. For someone who looks at it for the first time, such as probably many of the people watching our show, it's not entirely clear, but I assure you it will be by the end of this talk. So like, just bear with me for a moment.
I'm so excited.
I don't see it.
You will.
I believe you.
For now, I will just say that what you're looking at here, and this is what we call a cheek piece. So this is something that goes into the horse's, well, it's on the horse's cheek, and it's attached to the
bit,
the horse bit.
Yeah.
And I have I came prepared.
You always do.
I have a replica here. So this is what it looks like.
Oh, I thought you were going to put it on for a second.
We are being
I cannot
spoiled.
put it on, but you can imagine it goes like this.
Yeah.
And then these bits here that are made of copper alloy, these are the cheek pieces. So this essentially, it's a decorative thing, but it also prevents the bit from sliding out of the horse's mouth.
I always feel like you have to have a certain level of affluence to be decorating the cheek pieces on your horse. You know, you have to get to a certain level where that is where you can spend your time or your money and resources.
Absolutely. And it's a pretty solid piece of copper alloy. This was expensive in terms of just its very material value, but also probably quite difficult to make. And then of course it's also used with meaning, with like symbolic meaning.
Is it a very copper-rich area?
Not necessarily, not the area of Greater Poland as such. So they would have imported the raw material from other places, but which then again adds to its value, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, 'cause normally there's a focus on gold and silver, but there's a clear.
A lot of this material that we'll be looking at today is made of copper alloy or bronze, if you like.
Okay.
It has a very rich, deep color. If you treat it right,
it looks like gold. If it's nicely polished, it looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can see also here. There's a couple of other objects that have these animal motifs, and some of those on the left-hand side, they look. Some people told me they look a little bit like the Borre style heads, but they're not quite that. There are certain features here that actually differentiate them from the Borre style. But what you're really looking at is, again, something that is linked to riders and riding equipment, because this is a strap distributor.
Oh, okay.
This is how you would use it. You could use it for a belt worn around the waist, but most likely, in the case of the finds that you can see here, this was also part of a horse bridle, something worn on the horse's head.
Yeah, when the one you held up, you can see how clearly it separates the three pieces.
Yeah, exactly.
With the heads.
That's exactly the point. And what I want you all to try and remember is the number 3. There is a certain numerology in Viking Age art. In Scandinavia, as you know very well, the number 9 was very important. It seems that for the Slavs, at exactly the same time in history, the number 3 was very important. For Norse societies, of course, 3 times 3 is 9, and so on. 3 is in one way or another also important, but but probably the number 9 was the sort of Norse magic number. And for the Slavs, the number 3 would have been.
Does that predate Christianity? Because obviously you have like the Trinity with Christianity.
It does. Yes, it does. It certainly does. And please bear with me.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm jumping the gun.
We're building this up.
We are just like, we are so close to just kind of stealing Leszek's thunder with all of our questions. We're just not letting him create the buildup. Can I also say a little tidbit for the audience, especially if you're watching? It's been a while since I've joined for one of the animal and art style episodes. So I'm sorry, but also not sorry that I am pretty sure that I'm about to freak out, because animal art is what I do and I love finding new connections. So I'm so excited. Please continue, Leszek.
All right. Okay. So now you see this luxurious elite material linked to warriors. And then again, I will return to this problem that until recently we've had in Slavic archaeology, that again, a lot of the stuff that you're looking at, many scholars labeled as foreign imports. They were somehow, they could somehow not conceive the idea that this stuff could be Western Slavic, and that all the things that you're looking at are semantically and also stylistically coherent. And that's kind of what I will try and demonstrate in the next couple of slides. But before I do that, I have to give you a more proper introduction into, well, the core of the animal style, and also a little bit of the historiography surrounding this problem. So the idea that the Western Slavs had their own distinct animal style, it's not really something that I invented. I'm working on this topic right now, and I'm very involved in this, but this is something that's sort of been around, and people have whispered about it since basically the late 1950s. And I'm showing you this photograph of this gentleman, Jan Žák, who was quite a prominent professor of archaeology in the 1950s and 1960s. He actually lived in Poznań and worked at Poznań University. And he may not be so well known to Western European scholars of today, or generally people dealing with the Viking Age, but he was in fact in his time, one of the leading Central European researchers dealing with Scandinavian Slavic interactions in the Viking Age. And in 1959, Žák wrote an article which was titled Remarks on the Animal Style in Early Medieval Art in Poland. And in this article, he argued that the animal style, at least from the mid-9th century, is no longer a specific form only of Scandinavian, Rus, Byzantine, Romanesque, Baltic, Finnish, and Hungarian art, but also Polish. Around the mid-11th century, or perhaps a little earlier, it was adapted from Byzantine, Romanesque, and Rus art by Polish goldsmithing, probably primarily in the Silesian and Kujawian regions, so in the south of Poland and then in the north of Poland. I agree with what he said in the 50s, but of course some slight modifications to his claims are necessary. One of the problems that he had to face, and he was dealing with in the late 1950s and 1960s, was that he was very intuitive, and he kind of felt that there is something out there, that the Slavs, like all these other societies, must have had the animal style, but he didn't have a lot of material to back this up. The corpus of objects just was very, very small, and many finds that were available were actually at the time wrongly interpreted by other scholars, or there was a certain bias on their behalf, suggesting that, well, these objects with these animal motifs cannot be Slavic; they have to be imports. So he had a lot of opponents at the time.
Just to interject, what dictates something being a style? Because I would assume that every area would have its own slight change, because people are people and art is art, so they would kind of change things based on what they see and do. So how do you classify, something as being a style to then give it that kind of label, I guess?
That's a great question. And he didn't really say. He didn't really offer a definition of style, even though he actually used the term. And I think he couldn't really do that, because for something to be a style, well, first of all, you have to have a certain corpus of objects, and he just had a few items to sort of play with. But also there has to be a certain consistency, certain coherence within these objects, both in terms of how they look, but also the ideas that these things convey. And he wasn't really interested at all in, for instance, the messages that these objects were allegedly supposed to send out to the wider world. But a lot of things have changed over the last 60 years, and the number of objects has grown considerably. So right now we have, I would say, between 300 to probably 500 objects with these animal motifs from the territory of what is today Poland, and also objects that stem from this territory in other parts of Europe, including Germany, all around Scandinavia, Ukraine, Russia, and so on and so forth. It's interesting because the Mamen style, and I know you had a recording with Rebecca Frankowaje some weeks or months ago, and she's an expert on the Mamen style.
It was a couple of weeks ago.
A couple of weeks ago, yeah. So the Mamen style, as I know from Rebecca, is actually invented on the basis of around 100 objects only. And here, in the case of this material from the Western Slavic area, we're talking about at least 300, if not more. So if you sort of believe in the existence of the Mamen style, you have to accept that there is something going on in this Western Slavic area in the 10th and 11th century as well. So what are we really looking at? What kind of objects are we looking at? And it's not just riding equipment. It's actually quite a diverse group of finds. So we have objects that are conventionally females associated with women, then objects that can be sort of conventionally associated with men, and objects that are somewhat gender neutral that could be used across these different gender categories. And here are some examples. So you can see items that are regarded as female objects because they are usually found in connection with women in graves, for instance. So you have all kinds of bracelets, and the one you can see here has these animal head snake-like terminals. Then there are also rings, finger rings with animal motifs. Usually they look very much like snakes, or maybe winged snakes or birds. Then you have so-called kaptorgas, and the one you can see here with this creature that looks a little bit like a horse, but it's most likely a cow, which I will explain why later. These kaptorgas are actually small boxes that you could open, and they were worn around the neck like an amulet, like a little container.
So it's like a locket, but not
like
a locket?
locket. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like a little locket.
Go on.
That's so cool.
What would you keep in it, or am I jumping the gun?
Oh, well, lots of interesting things. And actually, one of them even had cannabis seeds.
I was about to say drugs.
Exactly. But probably not just that.
No.
So what's a temple ring as well? That interests me.
This is an interesting type of object, and an interesting term, especially in English, because when you see the term temple ring, you think of temples as like cult buildings and so on. But it actually has to do with the temples of the head. So you wear it on your head.
Oh, right. Okay.
So this is a head adornment. So women.
Like your hair?
You usually would have a band. A woven band, like a braid, or sometimes a veil, and you could just sew it onto the band or the veil, and it's a head decoration. Essentially, what I should probably say is that the main difference between the Western, or generally the Slavic female costume, and the Scandinavian costume in the Viking Age is that in Scandinavia, most of the bling, the metal adornments are concentrated around the chest area or around the neck, Whereas in the Slavic world, women mainly decorate their heads.
Wow.
And the reason for
Fun.
that, well, there may be many reasons why it is so, but I think, and some people have also suggested this, that it may have something to do with the idea of where your soul or vital powers reside. And as you know, for Viking Age Scandinavians, there was a lot about the chest and the breath, and you can send things out or you can welcome things into your body. And that is some sort of an essence. But in the Slavic world, there seems to have been an obsession with the head. And we talked last time about these multi-headed gods. So this is something that also expresses this idea rather well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but here's a couple of other things that I want you to look at. And these are those conventionally male artifacts. And some of them you've already seen. So these fantastic zoomorphic spurs and these cheek pieces. But also on the right-hand side, you can see a very beautiful category of objects. These are knife sheath fittings. So very small, very thin, again, copper alloy bars that have snakehead terminals at the end. And they would be riveted to a leather sheath for a knife.
Okay,
and
yeah.
we find them all across the area of Greater Poland, so where the place where the state was formed, but also in other territories that these early chieftains and rulers were interested in. So again, you see these animals here. And then you have these gender-neutral objects that are rarely found in graves, but they are found in villages, in settlement sites, in strongholds, and they would have been used by a wider sort of gender diverse group of people. And some of the most interesting of those are these small figurines. And again, I have a replica here. So this looks a little bit like a horse. It's very small, as you can see.
I was about to say, he's the most fabulous one.
Is that to scale?
It is, yes.
Oh, wow.
Okay, this is actually a replica from a find, actually from Denmark, but it's a Slavic find from one of the Danish isles that I commissioned from the island of Møn.
When I look at that, I think llama.
Yeah,
or alpaca. That's what comes to mind.
Yeah.
You know what? I think it's the pendant thing, or I don't know if that's part of like a functional thing or also a part of the actual figurine, but I understand what you're saying, Dan, because it's giving me a bit of Cusco from
I like to think of that as a halo because all llamas go to heaven.
Yeah,
so that's what I like to think of that as.
A lot of people until recently were very eager to interpret all these figurines, and I have another one here, as horses. But I'm not quite sure, actually. And why I'm not sure is because of this find that you can see on the right-hand side. And this is actually a wooden bowl or a plate that has gold plaques riveted to its surface. And if you look at the top part of the image, you can see actually that there's a creature that has horns, that has the body of a horse, a very strange kind of snake-like tail, and perhaps some sort of scales on the neck. So it's not a real, in the proper sense of the word, it's not a real animal you would normally encounter some jumping around somewhere in the field. It's some sort of a fantastic hybrid creature that combines at least two animals known from the real animal universe. So horses and cattle, but perhaps also snakes, and maybe even birds if these little, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but on the side you can see something that looks vaguely like a wing. So
oh wow, yeah, I was wondering what those
something, we don't have a name for it because we don't have Slavic Eddic poems or sagas, so we don't really know how to name these things. But it's something clearly special, and it's not unlikely that at least some of these figurines are actually small three-dimensional representations of this fantastic creature. But I'll leave it here for now and move on. So when we look at all these animal-related objects or objects with animal motifs, we take them as a group. there's one very clear conclusion that arises from this material. And the conclusion is that the Western Slavs in the 10th and 11th century are experimenting with 4 different kinds of animals. So with cattle, with birds, and this bird that you can see in the slide is a very special bird, and I chose it for a reason. For those of you who know a thing or two about birds, you will know. For those of you who don't know what kind of bird it is, bear with me. It will be explained.
You sent me a lovely video.
Yeah. Don't spoil it. Don't spoil it.
No, I won't.
And then, of course, horses and snakes. So they are experimenting in a creative way, but also in a very symbolically infused way with these 4 animals.
Were snakes found? Because I assume the other 3 were found in the area at the time. Were snakes?
Yes, but just like the common adder, it's not any particular super dangerous snake, but they would have been common.
Okay.
So what does it all mean? Because that's where we're trying to figure out, what does it all mean and why? Why were these people using these animals and in these strange configurations? Well, some scholars over the last couple of years have made some attempts to decipher this material, to better understand it. And I think one of the groundbreaking moments was when 2 scholars, Ingo Gabriel and Paweł Szczepanik, looked more closely at these knife sheath fittings. You've seen them in one of the slides already. And they argued that the knife sheath fittings, especially the more elaborate ones, such as the one you can see here, are actually miniaturized representations of the cosmos, of the Slavic cosmos. And if you remember from our last talk, we talked about this Svantevit statue, the 4-faced idol. And I mentioned that it's also believed to be a representation of the construction of the universe, where you would have the top part, the top tier representing the world of the gods, and the middle tier representing the world of humans, the Middle Earth, if you like. And then the lowest tier, the 3rd one, and again, it's the number 3, is the underworld. So this is the world of death and magic. And of course, this model where you have 3 parts of the universe is quite common in Indo-European societies. And the idea that they're all situated on some kind of a pillar or a tree. This also echoes these ideas that you have in Scandinavia, with Yggdrasil being like the lift, the elevator between worlds. It's somewhat similar, it seems, in the case of the Western Slavic world.
I absolutely love that statue. Every time you show it, it really just makes me smile as well. Yeah. I think it's such a great thing. I would love to see in person. I also feel like
it's in Krakow. You can just
I feel like they're all just covering their little bellies up as well. Like they've just eaten too much food. Like they all just like they're a little bit shy, and they're just like. I think it's such a great.
There are lots of course interpretations about this statue and why it has the hands positioned in this very particular way. And actually,
I think we covered it in the last episode.
Yeah. One idea, and we don't know, but it's interesting, is that it could have been a gesture of prayer. And actually, a lot of modern practitioners of Slavic traditional beliefs, they actually bow to the gods in this way by placing one hand on the heart, another on the belly or on the waist, and then they bow. And this is a sign of respect to the higher powers. But
I would
know it meant something for sure.
I would say to anybody who is just listening to this for the first time, go back and listen to our last episode together, because you go into detail on this statue, and it's fascinating. We talk about all the different areas, the different worlds, what they mean, the hand positions, what they're holding, the leg. One of them is missing, like the leg showing. It's, we go into it in depth. So I think that's people can just go back and listen to that.
Yeah, and then the spurs have also been interpreted in a very similar manner to the knife sheath fittings. And the idea again is also that they are representations of the Slavic cosmos. I don't want to really get into too much detail, and I think we have also covered some aspects of this. The core idea, or one of the core ideas, is that, for instance, the strap that you can see here, as well as this disc, which actually has a swastika motif, but this represents the sky, or the heavenly dome, if you like, and the swastika with the sun, on the disc, is actually the sun that travels and rises and falls on this heavenly dome. This is the sky, basically, and this is the rising and the falling sun. So it all makes sense. Whereas
I always wonder with things like that, and obviously I don't know any better, but at what point is it? Sometimes I guess, how do you not fall into the trap of maybe trying to over explain things, if that makes sense? Because that must be hard to do when you're looking at something for so long and you're trying to find meaning behind everything. How do you find that line?
Yeah, this is challenging, and this is actually you kind of posed this question in a perfect moment, because
good.
As I say here, all these interpretations are attractive and plausible, but they are not 100% certain, because in many cases they actually rely on geographically removed textual sources and folklore, because we don't have, Slavic early medieval Viking Age poetry, Eddas, and so on. And we also rely a lot on our imagination in trying to interpret these things. So what can we do? What is the solution? How can we remove all these sort of problems and biases? And my idea is to try and interpret archaeology through the archaeology that is available to us. So use a more
I love that so much.
iconographic method. Just forget about the texts, forget about the poems, forget about the folklore, and just look at the objects and what's actually on these items. And this, if we do that, and if you look at enough material, you can figure out some of the core principles of the Western Slavic animal style. And I think this is what I've managed to do. And of course, it's still open to debate, and it's still something that will be revised and expanded in the near future. But there are certain basic things that we can say already at this moment. As you already know, there are 4 types of animals that they are using in this art or in this style: horses, cattle, birds, and snakes. You also saw that in certain cases, they create animal hybrids. So they combine horses with creatures that have horns. In effect, you have horses with horns. Or you can also have snakes with wings. These are the 2 most prominent hybrid types that we can recognize.
How do you know it's a horse with wings and not a cow with horns?
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
right?
A horse with wings, or a horse with horns and not a cow with horns.
Exactly. That's a good point. Could be the other way around. Then, of course, as I also said, that some of these creatures can be represented in very realistic ways, like we immediately recognize that it's an animal. And in some cases, it's very schematic, like in some of the images that I showed you in the very beginning of the talk. And I will expand on that in a second. Now, there's also this, and this is important, there's also this idea that they seem to position these animals in very specific, not always, but often in very specific configurations. So often horses are shown very close to birds, whereas snakes are shown very close to cattle. And this slowly brings us to the snakes and milk motif. Then there is the idea of quadrupeds, or perhaps horses per se, in a position where the head is turned backwards. So this indicates some kind of agency of these creatures. They seem to be doing something, looking back or exposing perhaps their neck for some reason. So when all this and more, of course, is combined and put together, it seems that this style has its own, what I like to call visual grammar. There is a certain language within the images. What we can also say is that a lot of this art, this style, appears on objects that are associated with the highest echelons of society, with the elite, with warriors, with people who had affluence, who had power, who had financial, economic possibilities. These were not things used by your common Slav sitting in their house and making pottery. This is something for a very select group of people. Which
I was going to ask, I don't know much about horse riding. Is there ever a circumstance where horses are turning back to look at maybe the person riding, that maybe it could symbolize this type of scenario? I don't know if that exists, if maybe that's just something that happens, or maybe when you're going to war. Do horses do that and look back at the person?
Well, not really to the extent that these images display. So because the head is really turned in a very sort of aggressive,
I just wonder,
way.
I was wondering if it symbolized maybe a certain action that maybe when you're riding a horse, that's when a horse would maybe look at you, and that's
I'll get back to that also.
Oh, wonderful.
It's all coming. I predicted a lot of your questions, I think. So it's
amazing.
We've spoken enough times now.
All will be revealed. All will be revealed. And also two final remarks for this slide is that because these objects are so beautiful in terms of the decorative aspects, in terms of the material, they were probably commissioned for and by the elite. And if we place them on a map, they're all concentrated, most of them are concentrated in the area of Greater Poland. So this is the area where the Piast state, the early state, was formed. So this has to do in one way or another with the process of state formation and all the changes occurring in this area. And maybe it indicates some kind of a clash between the old pagan ways and the coming of Christianity, where suddenly the pagan ways are somewhat in danger, endangered, and they have to manifest their old ways in a more explicit way, which is interesting, again, if you compare this situation to, let's say, the late 10th century Denmark, because this is exactly where you have the explosion of amulets like Thor's hammers, these so-called Valkyrie figurines, all kinds of other small metal paraphernalia. They pop up at a time where, in theory, they shouldn't. At a time where nominally, theoretically, the Danes should all be Christian. But of course, they're not. So I want to show you this idea of realistic and schematic Western Slavic animal style. And you can see this best if you look at the different forms of these knife sheath fittings. And I've marked them and colored them in several different ways. So the red color shows anthropomorphic figurines or figures.
So human-like?
Human-like, yeah. Or godlike, if the gods were in human shapes or guises. Then yellow shows everything that is linked to snake-like creatures, and green to quadrupeds. And you can see how these motifs are repeated across the different specimens, but also how over time they become somewhat reduced. And the only persistent motif here is that of the snake, represented by this thin yellow bar, as if the snake perhaps was one of the most important, one of the most significant creatures for these people. And why, we will again get back to this, but we're getting close.
The one at B, they look like little rabbits to me. I don't know if it's because maybe the way that I'm looking at it, and they look kind of like rabbits looking downwards with the little ears. I'm sure that's not what they are, but
Oh, I see what you mean.
that's where my head went to straight away. It was like, just little rabbit.
Yeah, well, the imagination can suggest all kinds of
That was a very diplomatic answer, Leszek. That was very kind.
different ideas. It is what you want it to be.
Well, look, it's the way my mind works because C looks like a balloon dog to me. You know, when somebody makes like the balloon animals.
Yeah. Oh,
that's what C looks like to me. So my mind works in very bizarre ways. So don't listen to what I say.
I'll try to recalibrate your mind a little bit. I think hopefully by the end of this talk it will be recalibrated.
We all have our own frames of references.
Yes.
Yeah, we do. I don't know what that says about me, but
speaking
that's
of
where
frames
it
of
went.
references and why there's a sense of schematization here is because, as in the case of our modern society, if you're immersed in a certain culture and you recognize certain symbols, you don't have to see the entire image, the entire logo, to know what you're really looking at. And it was the same for them. You don't have to show the entire snake, for instance, in a super realistic way for people to understand that you're referring to the snake or to a cow or to the horse and so on and so forth. These references don't have to be very literal. They can be, but they don't have to be. And I think what we can see in this style as it progresses over time and enters the sort of Christian era and then eventually vanishes is that perhaps the sort of last samurai of the pagan Slavs, they simplify this animal style and they hide, they conceal these old ideas and old motifs because perhaps they can no longer be very explicit about them. But for those who know or who understand, well, they understand, they can see it. Here's a few more images showing this idea of hybrid beasts. And these are some of the most beautiful items. The one on the left-hand side, we don't really know yet what it is, what it was used for. It's certainly part of something bigger. But what you can see, and I again have a replica here, is something.
Oh, it's tiny.
It's very tiny. It's something that certainly served the role of a mount. It's again made of copper alloy, and it has 2 rivets on the reverse. But it's in the shape of what looks like a bird. But if you look more closely, and if you look at this bird's wings, you will notice that there's actually 2 other bird-like creatures inscribed into the wings in sort of antithetic poses, flanking the long neck of the main bird and looking in opposite directions. So it's like a bird with 2 birds within it. And
that sounds familiar.
And then again, you have the number 3. As regards the purpose of this object, as I said, we don't know, but it's very similar to these bird-shaped fittings on the spur. And what they do actually on the spurs, they have a very particular purpose because they serve as the fastening mechanism for this buckle. Usually when you find buckles for instance, in Scandinavia, but also in other places, they would have tongues here, like a needle. So you can actually drive this needle through the perforation in the belt. This one doesn't have a needle. So it's not really functional in this form. So for the purpose of locking it, they invented this kind of mechanism where it is actually this bird-shaped fitting that serves as the hook and then makes
so cool.
That's great.
But in addition to just being a functional mechanism, this probably also has mythological, symbolic connotations. Because if you look at this buckle, you will notice that it's actually also zoomorphic. You have 2 snakes touching one another with their lips right here. This is the first one. This is the second one. And then you have these bird-shaped fittings.
So then you have three heads interlocking.
You can say you have three heads interlocking, or what you have is some kind of a clash or some kind of a struggle between these creatures.
Yeah, I guess
struggle
birds.
that is played out, as we already discussed, somewhere in the sky, because this belt most likely represents the sky with the disc with the swastika on it. So this is what it does.
Yeah, because obviously birds eat snakes, so it could be that kind of.
Well, there's a lot of interesting, intricate connections between birds and snakes and dragons. As
so, this bird thing, I guess, that you held up, the little piece that you found. You said you don't know what that is, but that looks to me exactly like the.
It could be part of a spur, like something like the one that I had here, maybe even more elaborate. It could also be something else linked to riding equipment, maybe part of a bridle, maybe some kind of a belt worn around the waist. We don't know. Actually, we don't yet know, unfortunately.
Is it a single separated find? So you don't really have a greater context.
Right now we have 7 specimens like this, but they are all stray finds, and they are all
exactly. That's what I meant.
The finds. So
yeah. So it hasn't really been found together with other stuff to give any sort of indication.
Yet, but
yeah,
probably it will come one day.
Yeah.
Are they found individual or in pairs?
Individually, yes, individually. But there is one site where actually 2 specimens have been found, which is also interesting, in 2 different locations within the site.
Oh, because when I looked at it, it reminds me of the little fastening for, leg wraps.
Yeah.
Where you would like tie leg wraps up and then you'd use like a little hook. That's what it reminds me of. And I wondered if it could be one of those things.
Yeah, exactly. It's not unlikely. It's not unlikely. But we don't know. We will find out maybe one day, but we don't know yet. But yeah, this
I thought you were going to tell me we jumped the gun and you had it later in the presentation.
But there's definitely, if you look at this material, and especially about these hybrids, there's definitely this idea where in visual art, the Slavs combine birds with snakes or other sort of reptile-like creatures. And you can see it on the right-hand side. The item under A is a stirrup or a stirrup sort of plaque that you would attach to a strap and then attach that to the saddle. And you can see there are 2 creatures with sort of longish snake-like bodies, but with wings. And then
it's quite similar to like Viking, what I would see as like Viking Age art, but it's clearly not. Exactly. There's like similarities, but it's just not.
Exactly. This item actually, this find under A is a find from Denmark, from a grave discovered in the 19th century. And a number of scholars, including like very prominent names, over the years, they've actually interpreted it as some sort of a hybrid variant of the Ringerike style, perhaps created under Anglo-Saxon influence, the Winchester style. That's the interpretation you will find in literature. It's not.
I'm just laughing at the fact that like it's it just gets so, the explanations as to why this thing looks the way it does gets so convoluted.
Yeah, right?
Without like the idea of, maybe we have the Slavic style running around.
Exactly. It's really funny when you really track down and read all the literature that's out there, and you just create a historiography of the problem, and you see how people are sort of almost like desperately trying to make something Viking, like Anglo-Saxon, instead of just admitting, well, no, it's not. It's actually very different.
It's like, we can make it fit into the box. We just have to change the box a bit.
Exactly. It's again the same.
What do you think the reason for that is? Because that's something I've heard a ton on the podcast.
I don't think there is any like bad will here. I think it's just lack of knowledge, simply, and lack of communication between these different academic communities in Europe, a lack of awareness of one another's material culture, yeah, that's just that lack of communication.
Okay.
That's why we're doing this podcast, to
Absolutely, yeah.
show something else, something different, and raise awareness of this material. And then we talked about this back-looking quadruped, the horse with the head turned backwards. Why it is so? And yeah, as we said, like, I'm not a horse rider myself, but I collaborate with a lot of people who ride horses, and I have a colleague, Bartosz Ligocki, who's a reenactor, and he's actually tried and used these zoomorphic spurs in action. So he has a lot of very interesting insights into the practical use of this kind of material, these kinds of objects. But this is a pose, the horse looking back, it is a certain pose indicating some kind of agency. It has to mean something. And there have been different interpretations put forward. One idea is that this is a position which makes it makes it easier to bleed the animal to death, to slaughter, to kind of sacrificially, ritually slaughter the animal, to just, expose the arteries to make the fatal cut. That's one idea, which may have been the case here. You can see a horse grave from an 11th century cemetery in Poland, where the horse also has the neck turned in this very unnatural way.
Oh.
And people have suggested that, yeah, this is where it is positioned in this way because they killed the animal in the pit and they cut its throat, and it just bled to death in the grave pit as some ceremonial act.
Yeah, but how do you get a horse to lie down to slit its throat?
You don't. You bleed it, and then it just lies down when it's over.
But then they would put his head like that after in post-mortem?
Yeah, most likely.
Oh, okay.
But in this particular case, it's actually possible that the horse was already on the ground, like in almost like in a lying position. Because if you look at the legs, it seems that they have actually been tied. They're very close together. So the animal was probably
restrained,
and then just bled.
Right. Okay.
But I think, it's an interesting interpretation, but I think that maybe there's something else actually going on here with this particular position, that they seem to be repeating in different, on different types of objects. And maybe the idea here is that the back-looking head indicates the ability of the horse to go somewhere and come back. And where is it going? It's probably going to the other world and carrying the dead into the other world and returning to the world of the living or another soul or another dead person. And this is probably why this horse on the spur, on the goad of the spur, is shown in this very particular way, again with the back-looking head. Because what you see in the middle part of the spur, these horned animals, these representations of cattle, as we believe, could be actually human souls. We know from folklore that the Slavs believed that in the afterlife, the souls of the dead turn into cattle, where they graze on this otherworldly meadow. So if we dare to reconstruct the worldview, the idea is that the horse carries you to the afterlife, where you become a cow and you stay there and graze on this wonderful green meadow, which is on an island amidst the sea, and hence you have this wavy pattern, which probably represents water.
That sounds like a really nice afterlife. I'm not gonna lie.
It's not bad, right?
Yeah, it sounds really chill.
It's chill. It's not as warrior-like as in the Odinic halls.
But that also sounds, a bit tiresome.
It is
for eternity,
right? To go fight every day and then drink all night. And why not just graze on that wonderful meadow somewhere in the other world?
Yeah, but also that thing that you said with the horse, kind of carrying souls. That I'm very much not trying to retrofit. I'm just trying to find kind of where cultural beliefs maybe intersect and are similar, because that sounds very familiar to me with the horse as kind of being this agent that's able to pass through different worlds.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's very Indo-European, and it's a very universal idea, universal motif.
Europeans have for the longest time just been a whole bunch of horse girlies. We've been obsessed with horses.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So in looking at this animal style and in trying to deconstruct its meaning, I found the concept of material citation very interesting and very potent. And this is a concept introduced by Howard Williams, who's an Anglo-Saxon Viking archaeologist, and he defines this concept of material citation, which he illustrates here using your favorite hogback stones, actually. He says that these are practices of selection and deployment of artifacts, substances, images, architectures, monuments, and spaces that separately and in combination created mnemonic material references to other things, places, peoples, and times. And using hogbacks, he shows how they cite or index buildings and ships and tents and containers and caskets and saddle bows and so on and so forth, creating this bigger universe of things and ideas. And I think you can use this concept of material citation also when talking about these Slavic artifacts. And coming back to the question, why is it a style? Well, it is a style because, as you can now see, having seen some of these items, they are stylistically and semantically and in terms of configurations, very consistent, very coherent. So again, I'm here showing you several different categories of items. Under A, you have one of those temple rings. Now you know what they are. You have 3 animal heads, probably those of cattle. Then under B, you have one of those strap distributors, again with 3 heads, which may actually be horned. Then you have these knife sheaths, and admittedly, sometimes there are 2, sometimes there are 3 animals, but then again, they are horned. Then you have under C, another variant of a kaptorga. These are those containers that we talked about. But here again, you have these horned creatures. And in yellow color, I highlighted the motifs that refer to snakes. So there is a certain repertoire of motifs that they are using and that they are mixing and that they are experimenting with in a very coherent way.
Can I just ask a question so I make sure that I understand you correctly? So material citation would be a form of kind of cultural codes. So that this thing or this combination of things or images or shapes, if you know that this refers to these ideas or concepts or places or stories.
Yeah. I mentioned the number 3 and a couple of times that it could be a magic number. And again, you can see here with these different types of items that they all have 3 animals of probably the same kind, 3 cows or bulls on these temple rings, on the kaptorga, on the strap distributor, and on the zoomorphic spur. And as I said earlier, for the Scandinavians, the number 9 was really important. You had 9 Knights of Odin on the tree, sacrificial acts every 9 years, so on and so forth. Whereas for the Slavs, the number 3 probably was the magic number. The 3 worlds, the 3-headed god that they had, Triglav, a lot of rituals happening in utilizing the number 3. This was the magic number for these people. Now, what I want to do, and we are getting finally close to answering the question of why snakes and why milk. Let me show you 2 case studies. Now we have sort of gathered enough knowledge and wisdom to understand this. So what we're looking at now is we're looking at these kaptorgas, these amulet boxes, these small containers linked with women in most cases, or almost all cases, because if they are found in graves, these kaptorgas are found in female graves. they're all different in terms of the number of animals or the ornamental details, clearly showing that they were made by different artists and maybe for different individuals. But there are certain recurring motifs. So somewhat, you could say, some sort of canonical ideas that they just have to be there. And I again highlighted them using two colors. So you can see in green, you can see these holy cows. And in yellow, you can see a feature that at first glance is perhaps not that important, which is this strap that seems to be covering the backs of these animals, or sometimes it is positioned behind them, as in the case of this Kaptorga under A. But also,
it's not a functional.
It's not a functional thing. It's not something that, for instance, the artists added to keep the animals together to make them stick to the object. It's not. It doesn't have a functional purpose here. It has to mean something or do something else. And this one here under A is actually a really interesting find. It's obviously a Western Slavic find, but it's again from Scandinavia, actually. It's from a hoard from Lille Karleby in Denmark, not far away from Roskilde. But what you can see here, if you look closely, and I also highlighted it using this gold color, you can see that there are these thin twisted wires, almost like attaching themselves to the hind legs of these animals, to their bodies. Can you see that? And sometimes also wrapping around their mouths. All right. And then on the other specimens under C and D, you can again see these long motifs. So what is all this about? What's the point? Let's have a look at one more example before I explain this, but we're getting very close.
The drum roll.
Back to these temple rings. They're less complicated in terms of technology and craftsmanship. But again, you see these three heads, and all of those heads seem to be wrapped with, again, a thin twisted wire. And it's on every single specimen. This motif is always there. This wire wrapping around the heads is always there.
It looks like a modern rope.
Like a rope. It looks totally like a rope. Right?
I don't know whether they had ropes.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
So what is all this about? Now, to decipher this, and we've clearly traced a pattern using iconographic methods, I think we could stop here, but we could dare to take a step further and get back a little bit to the idea of entangling texts and folklore and archaeology. So let's try and do that in a I think, a careful way. So what is it that we are really looking at here? You have the Kaptorga and you have the temple ring. What is going on? I think this is what you're looking at.
I did not expect those images.
That's fun.
Yeah. And then why? What is all this about? Could this be imagery that shows snakes sucking on cows and milking them and drinking their milk? What would be the purpose of that? And why would they come up with this kind of idea? And is this something that's actually feasible in the imagination of the early Middle Ages, of Viking Age people? Does it make any sense at all? Well, it turns out that it actually does. In 2017, an Italian scholar, a comparativist and Indo-European researcher, Davide Ermacora, wrote a fascinating article called "The Comparative Milk-Suckling Reptile," where he actually traces across space and time the idea that snakes could drink milk. And he says that using a vast array of sources, he demonstrates that this motif of milk-suckling snakes can be traced all the way back to antiquity, that it appears in medieval manuscripts. It, for instance, appears in Olaus Magnus, who should be very well known to Margrethe, of course, because it refers to the Norwegian areas and the Sami people and so on. Then one of the images that you can see here is actually an image showing snakes trying to reach a cradle with little babies, because babies are, of course, linked to milk. They have milk in their little bellies, and the snakes want to drink that milk.
Who knew snakes loved milk?
Get to it. So there is this idea that snakes can have the capacity to drink milk, to absorb milk, and in doing so, in a practical but also in a symbolic way, it's not just about drinking milk, but it's also about absorbing some kind of energy and some kind of life essence. Okay. In other words, fertility, prosperity, wealth, everything that is linked to the broader idea of having cattle and having farm animals and just having a prosperous, good life. If a snake sucks it dry, well, there's nothing left. But there's also a sense of ambivalence in regards to how people treated snakes or thought about snakes across space and time. Because, of course, those that suck milk can be regarded as somewhat negative beings. But there are also snakes that are fed milk in folklore, especially, for instance, in Baltic countries, in what is today Lithuania. People still remember those beliefs, because there is this idea that the snake is the representation, or is actually the ancestor, that humans could turn into snakes. And so for the ancestors to feel good and to not harm the society in any way, you have to give something back, and you have to feed them, and you have to treat them well. So among the Baltic people, it was actually regarded as a good thing to have a snake in the house, a snake that you would feed and consider as a household member, basically.
I have a few snakes in my family, Leszek, so there's a few of them knocking about.
Yeah. But of course, snakes don't drink milk. This is what also Davide Ermakora calls impossible biology. They don't have the capacity to digest lactose. But this doesn't matter, because we're talking about the world of imagination and myths and so on. So for the people of the time, it made perfect sense that these things could happen, and they were also looking for explanations for things that they could not explain in rational ways. The cattle stopped giving milk. Why is this happening? Oh, it's probably the snakes that sucked them dry. In Icelandic folklore, there are also such beliefs, and there is this idea of a creature known as tilberi, and it's a creature that the witch could make in late medieval, early modern folklore. And if I remember correctly, she makes it using the rib of a goat, and then she wraps thread or wool around it, and sends this tilberi wherever it needs to be sent, for instance, to the next door neighbor, to suck the neighbor's cows dry, to absorb milk and wealth. And to recognize a witch that actually has a tilberi, has a creature like that, the witch would have certain marks on her body, and it's often these like long sticking out pimples, because this is where the tilberi returns. It sucks onto that sticking pimple and attaches itself back to the witch's body, obviously.
Would this kind of, I guess, demonization of snakes, is that linked to Christianity in a way? Because obviously you have the snake in the Garden of Eden.
Well, yeah, I mean, later on, of course, the snake acquires these negative connotations. It can no longer, even though the snake is an ambivalent creature in all these pagan beliefs, it's neither good nor bad. It can do different things depending on for whom it is doing these things. But of course, in the Christian understanding of the world, the snake is later on equated with evil forces, with the devil. So it's no longer seen as something something favorable, something positive. And this is perhaps why, coming back to the animal style and this idea of simplifying it, this is perhaps why these snake motifs become so schematic after some time, because they cannot be so openly displayed on the body and in the jewelry and among the elite.
Wow.
So it becomes very much an if you know type thing, but you can't really, there aren't enough clues for you to pick it out unless you already know what's going on.
Yeah, I think so.
Can we also address that in the bottom image here, literally, that you put up, that is a clear representation of a merman? Because I can't help but not
looks
look
like
at that.
The dude has a tail.
Yeah, he just looks like a mermaid.
Yeah, these I love these medieval manuscript images. I have a colleague here in Poland who's a medievalist, and he actually wrote a fascinating book about vampirism.
Wow!
And he runs a Facebook page where because he deals with medieval manuscripts, where he actually collects all these fantastic images of fantastic creatures.
Oh wow!
From medieval manuscripts.
Oh, let me talk to you after, and
let's do that.
I'll get his name. On the previous slide, I have to ask: did you draw those pictures, or did
I found them somewhere online?
You found them?
Yeah.
Amazing.
I wondered whether you commissioned
they worked
them
perfectly. It's like I just looked for milk suckling snakes, and
I can't imagine
they're probably AI generated.
Yeah, but I can't imagine what other context somebody else has asked for that image
Probably
to be
not
made.
not Western Slavic animal style, but
yeah, it just feels like such an odd thing that I can't really think of where else it's been made, but obviously it has.
Yeah, but to come back to the Middle Ages and the Viking Age, or the early Viking Age proper, and whether or not those people in that time could have had this idea of milk suckling snakes. Well, they could have, because there's actually a Arabic account put to parchment by a traveler and writer known as Al-Jahiz, who met Slavic slaves in what is today Iraq, and observed their customs and talked to them. And he left an account in a book that he wrote about animals, where he says that according to what castrated and intact Slavs claim of the snake, in their countries, it goes to the cow, it wraps itself around the hind legs to the knees and hocks, then lifts its chest towards her udders with its mouth to reach the nipples. The cow cannot, despite her strength, move. The snake continues to suck the milk. Wherever he sucks, the cow becomes weaker. If she nears the point of death, it lets her go. They argue that the cow dies or suffers from a serious illness in the udder that makes it difficult to cure. The snake is greatly attracted to the milk. If the vipers find a container of milk without a cover, they dive to drink it and sometimes vomit what they have in their bowels. Serious damage then affects those who drink this milk. And this is an account from the 9th century. The artifacts that we were looking at are from the late 10th and 11th centuries. So this actually predates these finds, and the account shows that, well, this was a belief in common or known in the Slavic lands. So I think that, and then combined with later folklore, makes it fairly feasible that they actually were referring to this idea. But what I also want to show you, and this is something we already talked about in private with Dan, is this little fellow. It's a
I've seen those.
It's a real bird. It's a real creature, and that's actually the bird that you saw in one of the first slides. It's called the European nightjar in English, but it has a much more interesting name, both in Polish and other Slavic languages, as well as in German. In Polish, it's called lelek kozoduj, which basically means Lelek, the goat sucker, whereas in German it's actually called Ziegenmelker, which just translates to goat sucker. That's the name of this bird. Now, what is special about this fellow is that it has this incredibly large mouth. And when it opens the mouth, and I strongly advise everyone watching this to go on YouTube and actually type nightjar and watch videos of this bird, how it behaves. But when it opens the mouth, it almost looks like the mouth of a dragon or something. It's like looks totally unbird-like.
Or a snake, because
or a snake.
Snakes open their mouth
exactly
so wide.
Moreover, actually, this is a bird that, even though it has legs, it doesn't walk very well. It almost cannot walk. When it's irritated, it makes this very strange hissing sound, which again makes it sound very similar to a snake. And probably it was called goat sucker, or regarded as a goat sucker, because this is a bird that feeds on insects. And of course, insects fly around farm animals. And if there are any problems with those animals, the cows or goats are not giving milk, people looked for explanations, and maybe, well, they blamed the nightjars for it. It's also interesting because in Slavic languages, the first part of the name Lelek, in some Slavic languages, it also is a name for the stork, and the stork is a very kind of symbolic bird in those societies, and it's also a bird believed to carry souls into the afterlife. And thus,
this is layered. I love it.
It's very layered. But there's another aspect to this, because actually these nightjars also appear quite prominently in popular culture. So in the Dunwich Horror by Howard Phillips Lovecraft, you also have these nightjars. I heard from someone that they're even in Harry Potter, and I think you could actually spot them in some of the Hellboy comic books as well. So they're all over the place. Very, very, very interesting. But
a very unusual little bird.
Yeah, but I think the bottom line here is that this creature, which is a real existing creature, is almost like a flying serpent or like a flying snake. And this brings us back to all these strange animal hybrids in Western Slavic art. Are they portraying creatures that exist only in the world of imagination, or are they actually referring to something very specific? I don't know. I don't have the final answer to this, but that's something that's, I think it's worth thinking about. Mm-hmm. It's worth discussing.
But that's what I love about interpretations of art from these periods, almost regardless of the geographical area, because to a certain extent, the fact that we don't have like a right and wrong cheat sheet makes it so much fun to pull on those threads and make connections. And then whether or not it turns out to, whether we can actually assess if this is, factually correct or whatever, that interpretation then might spark another connection. And then,
Exactly. Yeah. And as you say, it's all very, very layered. And the more you kind of delve into this, the more you read about it, and the more sort of open you are, the more things you begin to see and hopefully understand in the way they were meant to be understood. This is one other thing I want to show you, which I think is linked to all these ideas, at least in some ways. I don't know if you have been to Krakow in Poland, the city of Krakow, but perhaps some of our listeners had this opportunity. Every child in Poland knows the story of the origins of Krakow and of the Wawel Castle. This is the royal castle on the Wawel Hill, on a hill in the center of Krakow. And the story goes that there's a stronghold or a castle, and beneath the stronghold there's a cave with this evil dragon that eats cows and virgins and is generally a great threat to people and land. And so the ruler of Krakow, known as Krak, tries to get rid of the dragon, and eventually he succeeds in different variants of the story, it's either him or his sons or a hero that defeats the dragon. And let's say the hero defeats the dragon using a very cunning trick. So he goes to the dragon's cave and he brings either a cow or a sheep filled with sulfur, with some kind of explosive or fiery material. And so the dragon thinks it's a real animal. It eats this dummy filled with sulfur, and then of course feels this horrible burning sensation. So it wades into the nearby river, drinks the water from the river, and then explodes, of course, and releases the water, and that is the end of the beast. Now, every child knows this story, but doesn't really try to interpret it in any special way. But I think this story is actually closely linked to all the things that we've been discussing. The idea of milk-suckling snakes, the idea of absorbing certain vital life energies in this Krakow story, embodied by the poor virgins or the cows that are being sacrificed to the dragon. And then something needs to happen, some change needs to happen. The beast is killed by a fiery weapon and then releases water. What is all this story about? It's about the cycle of life. The dragon and the idea that it absorbs water or holds water within itself or sucks fertility represents the time of winter, when nothing grows, nothing lives, everything is dead. And when it explodes by means of something fiery, the coming of the sun, this represents the spring and the first rain that fertilizes the land, and everything can grow and return to normal again. So these are, again, we talked about these layered stories and layered symbols. And I think that this is where, and this is how we can try and read them. And now, why would people wear these kinds of objects that I just showed you? And why would the elite wear these kinds of things? Well, one interpretation is that they're wearing them to demonstrate to these common people that they are aware of these dangers and of the winters that are about to come, of the snakes that will suck your cows dry. But as long as they are in power, everything's going to be fine. The world will be in order and the sun will return. That is my interpretation, at least. And I think that in one way or another, it actually makes sense, I hope.
No, but for me, that tracks, because it's almost like wearing objects with those material citations, if you will, is it could, the way my mind read your interpretation or understood your interpretation was also that, like, it's a physical manifestation of containing that evil. It's like, hey, see, I'm empowered. This isn't happening because thanks to me or my kind of part of society, we're the one keeping this in check for you guys.
Yeah. We've already talked for quite a while, but I have the last sort of postscript to this, if I may, if we still have a couple of minutes.
We do, yeah.
So now that you know all this, you've seen all this material, I just want to show you a few highlights from the project that I'm leading right now, called Slavs in the North, where I'm actually looking for Slavic elite material culture, such as the one that I just showed you, in Scandinavia, and trying to figure out why it's there, what is it doing there, and what can we do with it. So I have a few case studies. I'm afraid, since we've already talked for so long, we cannot go into very deep detail, but I just want to show you a few examples, and perhaps, Dan, if you like, we could get back to it in one of the later episodes.
Absolutely. Let's not wait 2 years.
Let's not wait 2 years for that. Yeah. So one of the first examples is traces of this elite warrior culture in the material record of Viking Age Denmark in the 10th century. And there's quite a lot of it, actually, especially in places linked to Harald Bluetooth, such as this one here, the famous Trelleborg fortress on Zealand in Denmark. there's actually a lot of links to the Slavic world here. The first one and the most clear is actually the fortress itself, because fortresses like this had not been known in Denmark before this construction was raised in the times of Harald Bluetooth. The idea must have been imported from somewhere else.
I was about to say, because that shape is peculiar.
It's very peculiar, and of course it's very special. In this format, it doesn't actually exist anywhere else outside of Denmark. But the idea of these massive ring forts came from somewhere else, and it's highly probable that it actually came from the next door neighbors, which are the Western Slavs, especially the Slavs that inhabited parts of northern Germany long before the construction of these Trelleborg fortresses.
Let's check. Have you ever looked at or heard of Thornbrahenge?
No, actually.
In the north thing. Let me share my screen. Can you see this? Hang on.
Not yet, no. Maybe I might have to stop my sharing the sheets.
Maybe.
Yeah, I can see yours, Dan.
You can.
Yeah.
Maybe you can send it later on, but that'd be very.
It looks very similar, but instead of having kind of those two perpendicular lines going through it, it only has one.
Okay. Yeah. So, what's characteristic about these Danish ones is that they have 4 entryways or 4 gates.
This has 2
compass,
one at either end, but there's 3 of the kind of rings in a line going down, and it's a really kind of famous prehistoric site. And it just, as soon as you brought that up, it made me think of it. And I was just gonna see if I could pop a picture into the chat, because it really did kind of remind me of that. But sorry, please do carry on.
Yeah. So one point of connection is, of course, the construction of the stronghold itself. But then there is also a very interesting cemetery adjacent to the stronghold. And in fact, the richest grave in the cemetery is a man's grave, quite an old man by Viking Age standards, which one of my colleagues, Mirosław Kuźma, has recently reconstructed, and you can see it here. And you can notice that not only it's actually the richest grave, but it has something very characteristic in it, this T-shaped axe that you're already familiar with. Moreover, if you actually look closely at this axe's blade and this fantastic silver inlay, you will recognize something you already know very well, which is the bird motif, very, very similar to these fittings and other items. So this is clearly some sort of an emblematic, high-profile object, and thus we can speculate, of course, and argue that this could be the grave of a foreigner, perhaps a high-ranking Slav who had something to do in connection with the stronghold or with its construction. There's actually a couple of other graves around Denmark that have these kinds of axes, sometimes in combination with other features or objects that have a Slavic or might have a Slavic signature. Every grave here is a separate story, so I'm just gonna just show them with the place names, and whoever is interested, they can ask questions about it later or look them up. But this is a common indicator of potential foreignness of the dead.
Yeah, I think we can definitely do an episode on this and really get into
dive into all the nitty-gritty details. But as you can see, there's quite a lot of those axes. This one actually here on the right-hand side is from Birka, from Sweden, from one of the cremation graves. So again, a nice material marker These stirrups you've already seen from Jutland, from Wels in Denmark. Now it's rather clear that they have nothing to do with Ringerike or Anglo-Saxon styles, and that they are from a completely different part of the world, much closer geographically and culturally as well. And some further examples on the right-hand side from the same grave of the bridle with these cross-shaped distributors and these snake-like heads again. But also, this is really cool because over the last couple of years, things like this are beginning to pop up, and you already know what it is. It's the back part of the spur. This is the goad of the spur. So one such goad was discovered in southern Sweden, in Skegrie, in the early 2000s. But just last year, or almost 2 years ago now, another specimen like this was found in Denmark, on Zealand, actually halfway between Trelleborg, the one you just saw, Harald's Bluetooth fortress, and the Lake Pisa, midway between these two locations at a place called Herslev. It's exactly of the same kind as you can see here, as on the Polish specimens. And of course, you could argue that, oh, it's like war loot, or it's like some diplomatic gift or something. But you can just as well say, well, it's actually a physical trace of a Western Slavic rider that came and had something to do in this area, perhaps in connection with the politics of Harald Bluetooth. And Harald Bluetooth, as a matter of fact, had a Slavic wife, as well as his son's famed forkbeard. So no surprise to have Slavic high-profile individuals, warriors and riders in their very close and closed circles. Here's the find from Poland and several other fragments discovered across Central, Western, and Northern Europe. And the specimen under J is the one from Denmark just recently found. And I'm sure there will be more of those.
I mean,
they're
that
so
is
very
like,
similar, aren't they?
I mean, they're not even similar. They almost seem like, this immediately makes me think of, oval shaped brooches and stuff, where like distributed across all of Scandinavia, where it's like, we just, beyond a shadow of doubt, we're like, this is the same type of
it's the
something.
Same. We don't know that yet for a fact, but I have, and this is maybe something for a different episode where maybe we can talk more about technology and things like that. But there are some traits and some things you can actually see with the naked eye, suggesting that all these spurs, or at least many of them that we know today, were made in the same workshop.
Oh, that's cool.
And you don't need to do any special metallographic analyses for that. You just see it with the naked eye. When you examine the ornaments closely, you can see the same mistakes, suggesting that they were all cast using the same mold.
Right, okay.
That's cool. So
That's
cool. It's
really
almost
cool,
like a fingerprint.
It's like a fingerprint, exactly. So someone made a mistake in the past, but this mistake helps us actually find the fact that they are all from one workshop.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, so this is potentially a signal of cross-cultural interaction, high-profile warrior mobility. The people who owned these spurs were clearly very, very special. They were not your average warrior. This was a subculture of sorts, a group within a group. And then the final case, something finally getting us very close to Norse mythology. And that is the famous grave of the Firkat sorceress. Of course, very well known, I think, to a lot of the listeners of this podcast. Interestingly, it's a grave from one of those ring forts, one of those fortresses, Firkat. And this is also the richest grave in the cemetery, the Firkat cemetery. Presumably a woman's grave with all kinds of different things in it, including probably at least 2 magic staffs, henbane seeds, and small paraphernalia. Among those small paraphernalia was something that the various researchers call bird's feet pendant or bird's feet amulet. It's called bird's feet pendant because it has these plaques that look like the feet of a bird. But they could also look like the feet of a frog, if you like. The same kind of palmate shape. But this is the name attributed to this object. Now, when this was found and over the years that followed, everyone was very eager to say that this is not a Scandinavian style item. It's a foreign import, but that it's an import from Finland or Russia, somewhere from those northeastern European territories. Well, it's not. It's actually from Greater Poland, most likely.
Wow.
The reason why it's not from Finland or Russia is that even though those areas indeed have these kind of, let's say, duck feet pendants, in Finland and Russia, they are usually made of copper alloy and they're much bigger. The specimen from Firkat is made from silver foil and it's additionally stamped. And exactly this technology, this shape, this style is something that we see in the Western Slavic territories and in the Greater Poland area in the Piast state. And these duck feet pendants are actually parts of those famous temple rings that we just talked about, these head adornments. So these are just little chains attached to these temple rings that would be hanging on the sides of the head. So the Firkat sorceress, among all the weird things that she had in her grave, also had something from the Western Slavic world. Interestingly, she herself or those who buried her didn't quite understand how to use this object in the proper way or deliberately reconfigured it or reinterpreted this object. Because instead of placing it or wearing it somewhere on the head, on a band or on a veil, this duck feet pendant or bird feet pendant was found in the area of the chest or the waist. So maybe it was maybe it was attached or sewn onto a belt. It was just used in a totally unconventional way. And maybe she had it as an object literally and symbolically from another world. But this again points to some form of cross-cultural contact, direct or indirect, some kind of interest, mutual, and kind of interaction that has long been neglected, unseen by the research community. And
I think that's so interesting because to me that speaks to a form of like we touched on earlier, not necessarily an unwillingness to consider Slavic finds, but like genuinely awareness bias that people aren't aware of it, and therefore it's not even within the realm of reference. And therefore these, I'm hypothesizing here, but that's what it sounds like to me, where it's like, oh, we've never seen this before. It's probably some strange thing from like Finland or whatever. But so, I have nothing really concrete to base this off of. But to me, when you said that it was worn or it was found in like the chest or belt area, it made me think of the way multicultural friends of mine style our Norwegian national costume, where, having families from other cultures, they integrate those symbols or pieces of jewelry, but in a way that fits the way our national costume is traditionally worn. So it made me think of, what if this woman had family or friends from a Slavic area, Western Slavic area, and then she wouldn't then necessarily wear it the way that it's worn in those areas, because that would look out of place. But it's a sort of like cultural amalgamation of being like, hey, this is a piece from maybe another side of my family or something, an heirloom. And then since I'm in this area, I will now wear it here around my chest area instead. I'm just picking that out of thin air,
it's
but
fascinating.
Like an homage to.
Yeah, exactly. What's also interesting, I don't unfortunately have a picture here, but actually the same pattern can be seen in the case of another sorcerer's grave or a Velva grave from Birka in Sweden. It's also a grave with a staff, and it's also a grave with a Slavic object, but the Slavic object is a lunula pendant. It's these kind of moon-shaped silver pendants, which normally in the Western Slavic context would be worn around the neck as a pendant. But in the Birka grave, the grave with the staff, it's actually, again, like in Firkat, found at the waist. So it's like a recurring pattern of redefining these almost like as like parts of the national Slavic costume, right? But in a different cultural context.
Yeah. That's so cool. Yeah. I think, I love this.
Yeah, no, it could be like you say, Max, a case of in Scandinavian culture, there isn't that headdress worn. So it's I have this thing I want to pay some sort of respect to.
Yeah.
So I'm going to put it where we would wear something, and it's such a lovely kind of mix.
Yeah. So here's just the map showing the distribution of these bird feet pendants in Greater Poland. Mainly, as you can see, every triangle is a find. So you can see how many of them are here, and you can remember from the map from the beginning of this talk how geographically close it is to Denmark. Well, no wonder. Why look so far? Why look all the way to Finland and Russia, where you have a next door neighbor, and all kinds of other connections. As I said, Harald Bluetooth's wife was Slavic. His son's wife was Slavic. There's so much interaction going on.
I mean, just that in and of itself, I would say, is enough of a thread to immediately make those connections, because we do that with every other, intercultural marriage.
Exactly. Yeah. So
it's not, you don't have the water, like a waterway, even to get to Denmark. You can just
you can walk. You can walk. You
can go across
It's probably dangerous or long, but you can walk.
There isn't, like, even though we know obviously water wasn't much of an obstacle, that even you can't excuse even that barrier, because you can literally, for I guess for the distance of the length of Britain, you could just kind of pop around and see your Danish neighbors.
So we've come to the conclusions, and I think that after this talk, it's pretty clear that the Slavs, like everyone around them, also had their own animal style that differed quite considerably from Scandinavian styles, especially in terms of how the animals are arranged. They are, unlike in Scandinavia, they're not interwoven in all these intricate interlaced designs. They don't have these kind of tendrils growing out of them. There's no concept of the gripping beast in that Scandinavian sense of the word. It's very distinct. And also the animals are more realistic than those that you see in Scandinavian art. So once you've seen enough of the material, you just know that it's something else. And I think that either by just interpreting archaeology through the archaeology, you can decipher some ideas. But if you throw in a little bit of text and throw in a little bit of folklore, you can peel even more layers off and get deeper into the more intricate meanings of these finds. So I think what I tried to do in this talk is raise awareness, open a platform for discussion and interpretation and collaboration across cultures and languages and spaces and places, and fill some blanks here. That was my goal.
I mean, I would say mission accomplished on my end, at least, because I did not have this frame of reference. But now that with the examples that you showed as well, that I'm like, having worked with Scandinavian animal art the way that I have, when you started, I just started seeing examples in the way that you described and phrased it. I'm like you said earlier, Dan, I'm like, I'd see it. Like, I don't even need to be convinced because it's there. So I'd say mission accomplished, Leszek. And just as a fellow academic, thank you.
Keep an eye out for the material in Norway, because I'm sure it's out there.
Exactly. Currently working on my PhD about, Oseberg. So I'm excited to go back to my material and be like, are there elements that I've just kind of glossed over without even being aware of it?
Well, one of the fascinating things about Oseberg is, I think, Luciano Pezzoli's article on the wagon.
I'm so excited to get to the wagon.
That's really fascinating. And he's done a fantastic job trying to figure it out. And you can agree with it or disagree, but it's really interesting. And
it's a convincing argument. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Absolutely. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed for you and for him, and I look forward to what's next.
I think that's I love Luciano. I think he's been on here a few times. I think because he hasn't come through like a scholarly kind of direction into all of this, he doesn't have that kind of PhD background.
He has at least a PhD, in my opinion.
In practical experience.
A PhD straight away.
But I think he's dismissed very quickly, unfortunately, by academics, rather than give him maybe the credit that he deserves for his work, because it is.
He should be given a lot of credit, because I think it's brilliant. It's brilliant work.
Agreed. Yeah. Absolutely agreed. Oh, this was so much fun, Leszek.
Leszek.
I can't wait to dig deeper into this, and also to hopefully have you on more times. And
I'd love to. And thank you for having me, and thank you for spending these almost 3 hours with
I know. 2.5 hours in. No, thank you so much for spending your time with us. And like I said, we will do this again, and we'll look at probably a bit more in depth between those Slavic Scandinavian elite links, and then I'm sure we will plan future episodes from there.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and have a great evening.
Yeah, Leszek, where can people find your books? Or
you can find them online. The Vikings in Poland, which is my latest book, has just been released by Routledge in the Archaeologies of the Viking World series, so you can find it online. It's quite expensive. It's over £100 for the hardback, but there will be a paperback edition in less than a year, I think. So that will be much more affordable. You can find free articles on my Academia EDU page. And actually, a lot of this Western Slavic animal style, Slavic Scandinavian interaction related stuff will be published in open access in English.
Amazing.
So you can, again, find it on Academia. You can find it online. You can find it through my page on Facebook. So just type my name and the doors will open.
Wonderful. Max, where can people find you?
Whenever I do post or am active, it's usually on Instagram. That's Archaeomags, Archeo with a K.
There we go. And for me, it's Daniel_Farrand1, Horns of Odin for the business, and then the podcast is just Nordic Mythology podcast across the board. And it's that simple. Go and check out our Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. You can look at the lovely slideshow PowerPoint that Leszek brought, and all our guests tend to bring something, and there's that visual element. So I do recommend going over there and just hitting the subscribe button, the little bell icon, so you get notifications. And that's it. Thank you very much.